In 13 days, the TR site, along with our entire region, will experience the amazing, intriguing effects of a total solar eclipse. What will we see? What will be the experience? Why? We're thrilled to have Kevin Williams with us this evening via Zoom to explain what we should anticipate on Monday, April 8th, with his presentation, The Great North American Solar Eclipse, 13 Days Out. Kevin is Associate Professor in the Department of Geosciences at Buffalo State University and is the Director of the Whitworth-Ferguson Planetarium, also at Buffalo State. As he describes, on April 8th, 2024, a total solar eclipse will cross North America from Mexico through 13 states, from Texas to Maine, and over parts of Canada. Buffalo and Western New York will be in the path of totality for this eclipse, setting the stage for a celestial spectacle for residents and possibly 1 million visitors or more. Kevin will discuss and demonstrate what causes eclipses, how to view them safely, and what to expect for April 8th. After Kevin's program, we'll have a Q&A session with Kevin. Please place your questions in the Zoom chat. Our staff will read each question out loud on Zoom, and Kevin will answer them. Before we begin tonight's program, I have 2 eclipse-related reminders. Free total eclipse glasses are still available at the inaugural site. Please stop in and pick yours up. We also have a special National Park cancellation staff created by the National Park Service to commemorate this very special event. That stamp is available now at the stamping station located at our front desk. Stop in and stamp your book. Without further ado, we will turn the screen over to Kevin Williams. Kevin?
Thank you very much, Stanton, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk as part of your speaker series. I'm just going to share my screen now. So, yeah, as you said, I would like to talk about what to expect as we come up to the total solar eclipse in under 2 weeks now. And just to give you a sense of where we're going, I want to talk a little bit about what an eclipse is, why they're so rare and special. I'm going to talk a little bit about the safety aspect, but really how to prepare, what to expect, and finish up with, why we should care. There are some quotes that I really like that I'll share with you. So when we talk about an eclipse, we're really talking about shadows, right? In the case of a solar eclipse, we're talking about the shadow of the moon hitting the surface of Earth. So as you see in this diagram, you have the moon on the left casting its shadow on Earth, but notice that you have 2 different parts of the shadow. There's what's called the umbra, the darker part of the shadow, and then there's the penumbra, which is kind of like the partial shadow. And if you look at the surface of the Earth where the moon shadow is hitting, you have the darker circle in the middle, and that's where the umbra is hitting, and you have the larger circle of the partial shadow. Just to point out here, in order to see a total solar eclipse, you have to be in the umbra, right, in that darkest shadow. If you're in the penumbra, you'll see a partial solar eclipse. So when we were talking about eclipses, again, it has to do with shadows. A little bit of history with solar eclipses here in Buffalo. As you may know, the last total solar eclipse that was visible from here in Western New York was almost 100 years ago, back in 1925. You may also be aware that the weather here did not cooperate with that. It was cloudy that day. So in Buffalo, they did not see all the great things going on with a total solar eclipse that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Instead, they saw it get dark, and very dark, actually. So it's neat looking at these newspaper headlines from the day of the eclipse. This was the eclipse was in the morning, so this was the paper that came out afterwards. And then this was the final edition of that day. The eclipse thrills, but it was hidden by the clouds. They were able to see the eclipse further east along the East Coast and places including New York City. So it's been almost 100 years since Buffalo and Western New York have experienced a total solar eclipse. And I wanted to just take a second to talk about different types of solar eclipses, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, back in 2017, I remember seeing a solar eclipse, and actually in 2021, there was a solar eclipse that happened as the sun was rising. For us here in Buffalo, those were not total solar eclipses. For instance, in 2017, there was a total solar eclipse that passed across the United States between Oregon and South Carolina. For us here in Buffalo, we were not in the path of totality, but we were in the penumbra, so we saw a partial solar eclipse. For us, it was around 3/4 of the sun was covered. So that's one type of solar eclipse. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, before and after totality, coming up on April 8th, we'll also see partial phases of the eclipse. But there's also another type of solar eclipse called an annular eclipse. This doesn't mean every year. The word annular comes from annulus, which is the ring of the sun showing around the moon. In this case, the moon is not quite big enough to cover the sun. So instead you see that annulus of the sun. But the really spectacular type of solar eclipse is what we're going to experience on April 8th, which is a total solar eclipse. So let's do a little bit of trivia, right? See if you've been listening. When was the last solar eclipse in the United States? All right. And I asked this question earlier today at another presentation, and some people answered 1925 and some people answered 2017. But I reminded them to pay attention to the question, right? It's the last solar eclipse. It doesn't ask the last total solar eclipse, and it doesn't ask the last total eclipse in Buffalo. So the answer to this question is actually in 2023. There was an annular solar eclipse that passed through the southwestern part of the United States. Here we see what's called the path of annularity. So if you were in that path, you were able to see the ring of fire eclipse, the ring of the sun. For us here in Buffalo, we would have seen about 25% of the sun covered by the moon, but this was on October 14th. It was a Saturday, and it was actually raining here in Buffalo, which I think is a good sign, because I think if it was raining then, we're kind of owed some nice weather on April 8th. This is what an annular eclipse looks like. But as amazing as it is, it's still not the same awe-inspiring spectacle that a total solar eclipse is. So I think the answer to this question is a little bit easier, right? When's the next total solar eclipse? As you know, it's coming up on April 8th. And why are they rare? Well, one of the reasons that they're rare is because if you think back to that diagram I showed a little while ago, showing that darkest part of the moon's shadow, the umbra, only hitting a small part of Earth's surface, and then as the moon travels and as Earth rotates, that creates a path of totality. That path is pretty narrow. Depending on where you are, for us here in Western New York, it's going to be about 110 miles across. 110 miles is a lot, but it's not a lot compared to the size of Earth. So part of what makes a total solar eclipse rare is that you have to be in that path of totality. So for this eclipse on April 8th, it starts in the Pacific Ocean. It passes up through Mexico, passes up through the United States and parts of Canada, and then ends over in the Atlantic Ocean. Because this eclipse passes through Mexico, the United States, and Canada, you may have heard it called the Great North American Eclipse, because it passes through all three of the countries in North America. I do want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the sizes of objects like the sun, earth, and moon, because oftentimes we see diagrams like this, either online or in textbooks, and this is totally wrong in terms of sizes and distances. Because I think it's important to understand what's really happening to cause this total solar eclipse? And it ties into that question of what makes it so rare. Well, when we think about the size of Earth and Moon, these are the sizes of Earth and Moon at the right scale compared to each other. So we see how small the Moon is compared to the Earth. I like to think in round numbers. So roughly we could fit 4 moons across the diameter of Earth. Right? So 4 moons would fit across Earth. But of course, they're not this close to each other. In this diagram, we see Earth over on the left, the Moon. It's a little bit hard to make out on the right, but in this diagram, the Earth and Moon are at the same size scale and the right distance scale. So we can see how far away from Earth the Moon really is. Again, thinking in round numbers, we could fit 30 Earths between Earth and the Moon. All right, so we have Earth, we have the Moon. We need one more character to get a solar eclipse. And that's going to be the Sun. So how big or small is the Sun compared to Earth and Moon? Well, let's look at Earth over there on the right. I've shrunk it down a little bit from what it was on the last slide. And just try to visualize how big or small the Sun would be if we were to put an image of the Sun on here. And you're probably aware that the Sun is much bigger than Earth. Again, thinking in round numbers, we can fit 109 Earths across the diameter of the Sun. So 109 Earths stacked side by side would fit across the middle of the Sun. Instead of using that 109, let's round it down to 100 just to make things easier. So the Earth is 4 times bigger than the Moon. The Sun is 100 times bigger than Earth. So that means that the Sun is about 400 times bigger than the Moon. So how can something so small, the Moon, block out something so large like the Sun? Well, it's something that I like to call a cosmic coincidence, right? Not only is the Sun 400 times larger than the Moon, it's also about 400 times farther away from us than the Moon. So what that means is for us here on Earth, looking up at the sky, whether we're looking at the Sun or the Moon, they have the same apparent size. They appear to be about the same size. Now, the orbits of Earth around the Sun and the Moon around Earth are not perfect circles. They're ellipses. That means that sometimes Earth is closer to the Sun, sometimes farther away. Same thing for the Moon. Sometimes the Moon is closer to Earth, sometimes farther away. So when we think about apparent sizes, sometimes the Sun is a little bit bigger if Earth is closer to it. Sometimes the Sun is a little bit smaller. With the Moon, sometimes the Moon is a little bit bigger, sometimes it's smaller. So think back to those 3 different types of solar eclipses I showed you earlier. The annular eclipse, where you have the ring of the Sun showing, that happens when the apparent size of the Moon is not quite big enough to cover the Sun. In the case of our total solar eclipse coming up on April 8th, the Moon is larger than the Sun in terms of its apparent size. Now, just as a warning, we're not always going to be able to see total solar eclipses because every year the Moon gets 1 to 2 inches farther away from Earth. That means it's getting smaller in the sky a little bit every year. So eventually the Moon will be far enough from Earth that it won't be large enough to cover the Sun and will no longer have total solar eclipses. The good news is that that's not going to be for about 600 million years. So we don't really have to worry about that. Well, another question that comes up when we think about what causes solar eclipses is, okay, when we have the Moon between Earth and the Sun, we get a solar eclipse. Why doesn't this happen every month? Because roughly every month we have the Moon between Earth and the Sun. That gives us what we call a new moon phase. So why don't we have a solar eclipse every month? It's because the orbit of the Moon is actually tilted compared to Earth's orbit around the Sun. As you see here, usually when we have the Moon in the same direction as the Sun, it's either too high or too low for the shadow of the Moon to hit Earth. So in order to get a solar eclipse, we have to have the Moon lining up pretty exactly between Earth and the Sun so its shadow hits Earth. This happens roughly every 18 months to 2 years. But remember that path of totality is so small that even though it happens every 18 months to 2 years, it's solar eclipse is only visible from certain places on Earth. So on April 8th, when we have our total solar eclipse, a lot of people are focusing on totality, and there's good reason for that. That's kind of the main event during the eclipse. But the entire eclipse lasts for about 2.5 hours. That's from when the moon starts to cover the sun through totality, and then until the sun is no longer covered by the moon. Again, about 2.5 hours. So what do we have to think about in terms of safety? Well, it's never safe to look at the sun, the main part of the sun, without proper eye protection. During the partial phases, when just part of the sun is covered, so we still have part of the sun showing through, this is what the sun will look like if you don't have eclipse glasses. But luckily, most of us will be looking at the eclipse, watching the eclipse through eclipse glasses, and that will not only protect our eyes, but it will also allow us to see those partial phases. So for example, if 75% of the sun is covered, but you still have 25% of the sun showing, it's still going to be so bright that if you were to look up at the sun without proper eye protection, you wouldn't see the eclipse. So that's part of the message we want to get out there, is that, if for some reason you don't have eclipse glasses, don't bother trying to look at the sun. Not only will you hurt your eyes, but you won't see the eclipse because the sun itself is so bright. But of course, looking through eclipse glasses, we protect our eyes, and we're also able to see those partial phases. There are other ways to safely view an eclipse. You may have heard of pinhole projectors or pinhole cameras or pinhole projection. It's all different names for the same thing. What you do is you poke a small hole through a piece of cardboard or cardstock, or here what they've done is they've cut a larger hole out, taped over some tin foil, and then put the small hole through the tin foil. What happens is, as the sun's light goes through that hole, it projects an image of the sun on that second piece of paper. It's not really large, but big enough to see, and because the sun is behind you as you're doing this, it's totally safe to look at it. This can also lead to fun activities where maybe on that other piece of paper, you would trace the shape of the sun at different times. So you could trace the shape of the sun, note the time, maybe every 10 or 15 minutes during the partial phase. You can also, instead of putting one pinhole, maybe make a design, maybe put a bunch of pinholes making your name or some other shape, or maybe the letters TR. So you can do that and then have somebody take a picture of the crescent suns making your design during the eclipse. If you don't want to make a pinhole projector like this, you might have some items around the house that you can use, like colanders, the small holes in colanders. The sunlight will go through those and create a bunch of crescent suns. Other items like slotted spoons or cheese graters can be used, even crisscrossing your fingers like you see in the upper right. I don't think we'll really be able to see this in early April, but if an eclipse happens when you have leaves on the trees, the spaces between the leaves will create those pinhole projections of hundreds of crescent suns on the ground. So again, just thinking about how to view the partial phases, yes, you want to look at it through eclipse glasses with your eyes, but you can also do these other activities to see it either projected on the ground or on a piece of cardboard, or sketch it like I mentioned a minute ago. You might also want to make a pinhole projector in a box like this. You can use a cereal box or really any box. But again, because the sunlight is coming from behind you and you're looking through a hole in the box to view the projection of the sun, but because the sun is behind you, it's totally safe to look at that image of the sun projected in the box here. But you really do want to look at the sun. You just want to make sure you do it safely. And so what you see here in this picture, most people have eclipse glasses. A few people have index-sized cards that we call eclipse viewers. basically the same thing, but instead of looking through a pair of glasses that are over your ears, it's just a rectangle that you hold in front of your face. But then you also notice some people are looking away from the sun. That's fine too, right? The sun is going to be about 45 degrees above the horizon. That might get uncomfortable on your neck after a while if you're not in a recliner or something. So you, like I said, you do want to look at the sun, watch the eclipse, but you just want to make sure you do it safely. A thing to remember in order to watch the sun safely is that during those partial phases, or before or after the eclipse, anytime you're looking at the sun when it's not totally covered by the moon, you have to have your glasses on. The only time it's safe to take off your eclipse glasses if you're looking at the sun is during totality. And you actually want to take off your eclipse glasses because otherwise you won't see anything. So we'll talk in a second about what you'll see during totality, but again, this is a good rule of thumb to remember. Anytime that you see any part of the sun showing when it's not totally eclipsed by the moon, you need to be using your eclipse glasses to look at the sun. So time-wise, these times are rounded to the nearest minute, but remember that the exact timing of these different events during the eclipse depend on your exact location. They're pretty close to each other in the Buffalo area because one of the things that's happening as, remember what we're actually experiencing is the shadow of the moon passing over Earth. Well, in this area, the shadow of the moon is going to be traveling over 2,300 miles an hour. So whether you're in Lackawanna or Buffalo or Tonawanda, it's seconds difference, if that. So around 2:05 in the afternoon on Monday, April 8th, that's when the eclipse starts. That's when the moon's penumbra, the moon's partial shadow, will start to cover us. And that's when we'll start to see the sun being covered by the moon. We have about an hour and 13 minutes of that first partial phase until we reach totality around 3:18. Totality lasts for us about 3 minutes and 44 or 45 seconds until about 3:22. But then remember that after totality, the eclipse is not done. We have another hour and 10 minutes of the second partial phase. And that's when, again, part of the sun will be covered by the moon, but during that hour and 10 minutes, we'll see more and more of the sun exposed. Let me just make sure I didn't skip a slide. Yeah. So this is just an animation showing that idea of that outer circle being the penumbra, the partial shadow. As soon as that starts covering us, that's when we enter the first partial phase. And then that darker black circle in the center, that's the umbra, the main part of the shadow, the dark shadow. And it's when we're covered by that umbra that we experience totality. And then after it passes over us, we have another partial phase as the penumbra continues to pass over us. As this repeats, notice that even though a lot of the focus is on the path of totality, because that's where you have to be to see the total solar eclipse, that circle of the penumbra is covering all of North America, except for some parts of, well, most of Alaska, I guess. So as long as you're in that larger outer circle, the penumbra, you'll be able to see a partial solar eclipse, kind of like we did in 2017. So the entire population of the continental United States will be able to see an eclipse. It's just those of us that are lucky enough to live in the path of totality or those that travel into it are the ones that will see the total solar eclipse. So what will we see? Well, as I mentioned, in order to see the partial phases, you have to be using eclipse glasses. And as you look up at the sun, you'll see the crescent sun. At first, you might think that you're looking at the moon here. You are, but the moon is that black circle on the right. The yellow crescent is the sun. And so as we get closer and closer to totality, we'll see that crescent get thinner and thinner. Just as a warning, as you're looking at the partial phase through your eclipse glasses, it will not be this big. I think it's probably a good idea to set expectations on how big the sun will appear through your eclipse glasses. And the way you can do that is on the next day that it's sunny outside, just look at the sun through your eclipse glasses. You don't have to be looking at the sun during an eclipse. On any day, you can look at the sun, and that'll give you an idea of how big the sun will look on the day of the eclipse. But then there are some really interesting things that we're going to be watching for as well. You may have heard of Bailey's beads. What we're seeing here along the top there are Bailey's beads, where they're the last bits of bright sunlight passing through low areas on the moon's surface. So low craters or valleys on the moon, sunlight will be passing through there, creating what looks like beads on a bracelet. As a warning, though, even though you may have heard of these, it's unlikely that we'll see these just looking through eclipse glasses. Usually you would need either telescopes or binoculars with proper filters to see these, because they're very small. But what we should be able to see through our eclipse glasses is a phenomena called the diamond ring effect. And the reason it's called this is what we're looking at here is the last bit of sunlight. So not just those beads, but now those beads have either coalesced or there's just one remaining. And we see that last bit of brightness from the sun at the same time as the other area around the moon starts to glow, or it looks like it's glowing. And so it looks like a diamond ring. You will be wanting to still be wearing your glasses when this happens, right? Because we're still seeing part of the sun, even though it's a very small part. But you should be able to see this during as you're watching the sun get thinner and thinner, right before totality. And what I mean by right before totality is like the 3 to 5, maybe 10 seconds before totality. So it only lasts for a few seconds, but that's why you want to be aware of the time. You want to be watching for this as the crescent sun gets thinner and thinner. It should get small enough that it transitions into this diamond ring effect. Depending on the glasses you have, you might see it as like an orange color. But once the diamond ring effect disappears and you can't see anything else through your eclipse glasses, that's when you know it's safe to take them off, because that's when we've entered totality. So during totality, again, that's when the moon totally covers the sun. We're no longer able to see any of that bright part of the sun. And once that's blocked out, we can see the sun's corona. So that outer wispy area that you see in this image, that's the sun's corona. Sometimes it's described as being the outer atmosphere of the sun. It's about 2 million degrees, but we don't normally see it because the sun itself is so bright. So you want to look for the corona. It's going to be like 2 to 3 times wider than the sun, just because it extends out from the sun. It'll look like silvery thread or silvery hair. And again, you have to have your eclipse glasses off. It's totally safe to be looking at the sun during totality without your glasses. But you also want to be looking around at other things. So here's a view that's not zoomed in like the last slide was, but you can see the sun up there with the corona around it. But also notice that it's not nighttime dark, right? The darkness that will happen during totality is more like a half hour or 45 minutes after sunset on a normal day. And part of the reason it doesn't get totally dark is because notice that near the horizon, it looks like sunset. One of the things that we'll want to look for during totality is what's called a 360-degree sunset. Basically, all around us, the color of the sky near the horizon will look like sunset. Now, for most of us, there'll be things in the way, like maybe buildings or trees, but if you have a clear view of the horizon around you, you'll want to look for those sunset colors. But as you look more in the direction of the sun and moon, the sky will get darker. It'll get to deeper blues and purple colors. And because of that darker sky, you'll be able to look for bright stars. And some of those stars you're going to want to look for are some of the stars in the constellation Orion. So you might be aware that Orion has those 3 stars that line up in a line that make his belt. Look for those in the southeastern sky during totality. You would also want to look for Orion's right shoulder, a bright star named Betelgeuse, and his left knee or left foot, a bright star named Rigel. But there are other things we can see besides the stars and the sun's corona. We can see some planets as well. And so where to look to see planets during totality on April 8th? Well, first of all, to the upper left of the moon, look for Jupiter. Jupiter is going to look like a bright star. But if you know where you're looking and what you're looking at, you'll know that it's Jupiter. To the lower left of the moon will be Venus. Venus will be even brighter than Jupiter. So we should be able to see Venus and Jupiter. Now, Saturn isn't as bright as Venus and Jupiter, and it's also closer to the horizon where the sky will not be as dark. So look for Saturn, but you might not be able to see it. And it's not labeled here, but just a little bit lower and to the right of Saturn would be the planet Mars. So look for Saturn and Mars over in that part of the sky. Notice the letters down toward the bottom. S is over on the left and W is over on the right. So when we're looking toward the sun and moon, we're looking to the southwest. And I think I mentioned it before, but the sun will be about 45-ish degrees in the sky above the horizon. So it should be nice and high for you to view. What you want to do, if you want to get an idea of where the sun will be on the day of the eclipse, is the week leading up to the eclipse, on a day that's not cloudy, just see where the sun is between 3 and 3:30. It'll be in almost the same place on the day of the eclipse. So again, we want to think about what we're going to see during the partial phases of the eclipse, but also what to look for during totality, the corona. And remember that that black circle in the middle of the corona is the moon. Look for bright stars, look for the planets, look for the 360-degree sunset colors. But it's more about what we're going to see, because there are some other ways that we're going to experience the eclipse. One of them is by feeling the temperature change. Because remember, the sun doesn't only give us light, it also gives us heat. So as the sun gets blocked more and more, probably starting around 3 o'clock in the afternoon before totality, we'll start to notice it get a little bit cooler, and it'll get cooler and cooler as we get closer to totality. Once we get into totality, the temperature may have dropped anywhere between 10 and 20 degrees. And that change in temperature could cause it to get windy as well. So what I've been telling people too is that if you're not going to be at your own house, where you can quickly go in and grab something to keep warm, don't just dress for whatever the temperature is expected to be that day, but also have an extra layer for that extra 10 to 20 degrees cooler. So we want to see different things during the eclipse. We also want to feel that temperature change, and we want to use our ears to listen for what we're hearing, specifically with animals. So you may have heard that animals will behave kind of in different ways as we get closer and closer to totality. Some animals will start to behave like it's starting to get nighttime. For example, chickens may go into their coop and get ready to roost. Birds may start to roost on tree limbs or telephone wires. Once we get to totality, birds may stop singing. Other animals, the zoos along the path of totality, are going to be noticing what the animals do based on what zoos have done in past eclipses. Animals such as giraffes run around in circles. Primates like gorillas and chimpanzees act confused because they know that it shouldn't be nighttime, but it's dark. Alligators, for example, would be kind of what's the word they use? Bellowing, because it's something they do in the evening, I guess. So I'm guessing that nobody really has a pet giraffe to watch, but pay attention to what your household pets are, whether you have dogs or cats or whatever. Are they acting differently? A question that comes up sometimes is, do we have to worry about our dogs or cats looking up at the sun? Do we have to keep them indoors? The answer is no. They'll know something's kind of going on weird because it's dark, but they're not going to look up at the sun, so you don't have to worry about protecting their eyes. So I like to try to talk about not just seeing the eclipse, but experiencing the eclipse, right? Taking it all in, because The really different part is during totality. And remember, once you're in totality, it only lasts for 3 minutes and 45 seconds or so. It's going to go by quickly. So use that time as much as possible to experience what's going on. So what are some other things to think about as we're getting ready for April 8th? Well, we want to remember that, as we said before, we are near the center of the path of totality, but many people are not. And so you've probably heard that we're expecting a lot of people to come into the path of totality from outside the area. Notice in this diagram that the path of totality does not extend up to Toronto. So there could be tons of people from Toronto traveling into the path of totality in places like St. Catharines and Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. Many of those people might come over onto the United States side, but in New York State, the path of totality doesn't go anywhere near New York City. So there may be lots of people from New York City coming into the path in places like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. For our event that we're having here at Buffalo State, I've been getting emails from people from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Florida, Oregon that are coming in to Buffalo to experience the eclipse on April 8th. Also notice in this diagram that much of the path in this area is taken up by Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So unless you're going to be out on a boat, most of those people, whether they're residents or visitors, are going to be in the limited amount of land. So again, you've probably heard predictions. There could be as many as 1 million people, maybe even more, coming into the Western New York area. We won't know until the day of. Another thing about this eclipse in this area is that the interstate, the thruway, the 90, goes right along the path of totality in this area. So people who might want to be driving to get to an area that's not cloudy, they'll be kind of driving along the thruway the day of. So all of that kind of leads to the issue of traffic, right? And so you've probably heard that there will be traffic. So what to expect in terms of traffic? We don't know because it'll depend on how many people actually show up. When we see pictures like this, these are from places in 2017 that were along the path of totality. There were kind of smaller areas that didn't have a lot of roads leading out of the area. So I'm not expecting that all the roads in our area will look like this, but some of the roads could, right? Especially if there's an accident. So one of the things that the city of Buffalo and folks from the county are saying is that just be patient, right? Expect there to be traffic, and a lot of those people are going to be from out of the area and maybe not familiar with the roads. So just be patient. Don't be in a rush to get anywhere because that'll just make you frustrated. In terms of what the traffic will be like in the morning leading up to the eclipse, if it's kind of like in 2017, places along the path of totality, the traffic should continue to get heavier and heavier throughout the morning. People will start to fill up parking lots at shopping centers, grocery stores, anywhere that they can park in big parking lots. People will also start to park along the side of the road. Eventually, people will stop along the sides of the thruway. Pretty much, there'll be people everywhere. So again, just expect there to be a lot of people. You may have also heard recommendations from the city and county that, because of all these people coming in, and many of them will be here for the whole weekend, plan your time kind of like if you have an expectation of a big snowstorm coming, you're going to go out and maybe fill your gas tank and go grocery shopping. Don't do that the weekend before the eclipse. Do it maybe next week on Thursday or Wednesday if you can, right? Same thing with medications. Make sure you have medications you need so you're not running out Monday afternoon in all the traffic. Because of all the people coming in, don't be surprised if you have trouble connecting your cell phone to your cell service, because the cells towers are going to be overwhelmed. And so if you have to get in touch with people, maybe have an alternate way to stay in touch, or a meeting place, or at least a plan, so that if you can't get in touch with them, things are okay. So a lot of it is just about preparation, right? We want to make sure that we know what to expect, not just in terms of the eclipse itself, but also everything surrounding the eclipse. But it is something that is just amazing, and we shouldn't get worried or too bogged down in the logistics. We should be prepared, but we should also be excited about this eclipse. So I like to use some quotes from David Barron. Some of you might have heard of him, but he's an author and a journalist. He can say these things much better than I can, but so I'm using a couple of quotes from him. Back in the 1990s, he was going to be traveling to see his first total solar eclipse, and he talked to an astronomer before he saw the eclipse. And the astronomer told him that you owe it to yourself to experience a total solar eclipse before you die. And after David saw his first total solar eclipse, now he goes around the world telling people that you owe it to yourself to experience a total solar eclipse before you die. He's a self-proclaimed eclipse evangelist because his first total solar eclipse, and he's seen several since then, just moved him so much. One way he described it as a total solar eclipse is a primal transcendent experience. You know, the shutting off of the sun. That's basically what happens during a total solar eclipse, right? The sun disappears in the middle of the day. And then the last quote from him, after talking to that astronomer, he expected to have an interesting intellectual experience. But he kind of figured it was really the astronomers and eclipse junkies that were getting really excited about it. But instead, it was completely visceral for him, meaning that it was a much deeper feeling that he had, this connection. The way he describes it is that, you know, we think about ourselves on Earth, we realize we're on Earth, but we don't really think about Earth being part of the solar system most of the time. But when you experience the sun being blocked by the moon and you can see other planets, and you're thinking about the shadow of the moon passing, racing across the surface of Earth and allowing us to experience this, you are now part of the motions of the objects in the solar system. And for many people, it has that much deeper connection. Many people, after they see a total solar eclipse for the first time, they ask themselves, when is the next one and how can I go see it? Because they want to see it again. A few minutes of totality isn't enough. And so for us here in Buffalo, the next one is going to be in 2144, 120 years in the future. So this is our chance to see a total solar eclipse before 2144 without having to travel. And so I want to show part of a video that was put together from the 2017 eclipse. And there's a little bit of music in the background, but I'm going to talk a little bit over it. This is a time lapse, so we don't have to sit here for 2.5 hours, but you see the moon starting to pass in front of the sun in the upper right. And again, this is the first partial phase when we'd be looking at the sun through our eclipse glasses. Most of us are not going to be watching it for the whole time. We're going to be looking up at the sun every now and then, maybe using some pinhole projectors. But just as a reminder for us, all right, turned off, there we go. For us, that partial phase starts around 2:05 in the afternoon. Totality is at 3:18. And as I mentioned a little while ago, around 3 o'clock, that's when we're really going to start noticing a difference. Because when the eclipse starts, around 2:05, for about an hour, we won't really notice much changing besides our view of the sun. It won't get dark immediately. We won't notice a temperature change until around 3 o'clock. That's when we'll start to notice the color of the sky changing slightly. The temperature will start to drop. We'll be watching the sun, the crescent of the sun, get thinner and thinner. Once it's gone, we enter totality. And again, this is when we're able to see that corona. We take off our eclipse glasses, look at the corona, look for those bright stars, planets. When I was talking about using your ears, don't only listen for birds and maybe some other animals, but listen for people too. a lot of times people start cheering or clapping once totality is reached. I'll also recommend that maybe soon after totality, or at least later that day, write down what you experienced. Because even though you'll remember this for the rest of your life, you might not remember all the details. So you might want to refer back to some notes that you make that day. But after those 3 minutes and 45 seconds, if we have our eclipse glasses back on, we'll want to look for a diamond ring effect again. It's only going to last a few seconds, but then once we have that crescent sun back, the sky will get bright again, the temperature will rise back to where it was before the eclipse. But remember, the eclipse isn't over. We still have until 4:32 of that second partial phase. A lot of people are kind of sad during this time because, again, totality is such an amazing event that once it's over, you're left wanting more. So I won't bring us all the way to the end of that eclipse. But before taking questions, I'll just note that we have been having a lot of eclipse-related activities at the planetarium, including our public shows. That's what's on the left there. Pretty much for this weekend, and well, I guess this weekend they're sold out. We have a bunch of shows on April 6th. They're starting to sell out. On Sunday, April 7th, between 10 and 2, we're having a NASA day here at Buffalo State where there'll be a few talks by NASA engineers and scientists. There'll be activities. We're going to have moon rocks on display between 11:30 and 12:30. We'll have some more information coming about that very soon. And then, of course, on April 8th, our big event that we have over at our football field is Eclipse Fest. Any information you want about any of the things we're doing, including eclipse classes that we have too, if you go to eclipse.buffalostate.edu, you can find more information about that.